Hi and welcome to School Shorts with me, Melissa Chan-Green. To give you an idea of how long this episode's guest has been pushing for change in the way kids read, when he began, TLC was topping the charts and the sitcom Friends was just beginning. 3 decades later, and Professor James Chapman has been at the table shaping what those changes are. But what's really interesting is what he thinks is still missing, which is research around the way kids feel about how they're learning. We'll have more on what he means by that in this episode. And also his thoughts on big open plan classrooms and what he calls false praise. Some teachers and some parents may disagree, or maybe a lot of you will agree. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining me, James. It's been a long time coming for you, I think, in terms of seeing a structured approach or a more systematic approach in our classrooms. Now that it's here, how are you feeling about the implementation so far?
I hear mixed reviews about how the implementation is going. And I get quite a few emails from people who know me saying, oh, this is wrong, that's wrong, or they're doing too much here, doing too much there. But my view is that that's fairly inevitable. As of towards the end of last year, we had 7 approved providers of professional learning and development on structured literacy. I was on the selection panel with the Ministry of Education, and there were always going to be differences. And the only way to avoid differences is doing what happened with reading recovery. That is, you have a one-size-fits-all across the whole of the country with very little approved variation. So I'm aware that it will be a little bit choppy and variable across the country. Some schools will do better than other schools. Some providers will probably do better than other providers. But I think the really good part is all providers are really, really committed to making significant changes in the early literacy learning outcomes for kids in our junior primary school system.
We have learnt a little bit about, in School Shorts already, what this structured approach actually is. But I just wanted to ask you, because I think some parents will still be thinking, okay, it sounds good, but the previous method at the time we thought sounded good too. So how do we know that this is actually the right method? How do we know that in 20 years' time, we're not going to say, oh, actually, we know better now and we're going to do something else?
I think in 20 years' time, there's every chance we'll say that. But I think the big difference between what we're attempting to do now and what we've been doing in the past is that what we're attempting to do now is based on a very substantial body of scientific research on how children learn to read and therefore on how best to teach them how to learn to read. The previous system, often referred to as whole language, sometimes referred to as balanced, it's not balanced, but that's another issue, was not based on empirical research. It was based on a belief system that, things like phonics and skill and drill are really kill and drill. Kids get turned off. So let's make reading much more interesting, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. Let's get kids not bogged down in how to decode words, how to figure out words, but just get the general understanding, and they will eventually get it. The problem was that up to 30%, possibly more, kids didn't easily get it at all, and so those kids were disadvantaged. But now we have a large body of research that's been underway really since the early 1980s that shows that what we've been doing in the past, not only in New Zealand but other countries, has failed far too many readers. And what we need to do is adopt a far more systematic approach to helping kids learn how to actually decode the words that carry the meaning in text. That's the most important thing. So there's really massive differences between the research that we have now and the research that wasn't available or was ignored at the time.
Yeah, it's taken a long time for it to kind of filter through to classrooms, hasn't it? And I know you've been on a group that has been advising the minister on how to bring this in. I wanted to look through just at some of the recommendations and some of what the public had heard from the group on the way through, one of which was around checkpoints. What is meant by checkpoints? Is this a way of like tracking a child's progress?
Yes, yes, it is. Excuse me. It is very much a way of tracking it. In the previous system, the first checkpoint was really after a child had been in school for 12 months and he or she went through a reading recovery screening process. That was in year 2. Now, a heck of a lot happens in the first year of schooling. So the Ministerial Advisory Group, based on the research that we had at hand, and it was a mixture of researchers and classroom practitioners, we thought, well, we can't leave it too long as we did, say, for reading recovery. I call it a wait to fail program. You wait until kids have failed and then you say, oh, gee, we should stick them in reading recovery if there's room for them. Well, on the Ministerial Advisory Group, based on the enormous progress that typically children can make during the first year of schooling and learning to read, we should have a checkpoint after the first 6 months. And the purpose of that is to immediately identify those kids who are starting to fall behind so that we can provide a bit more additional support for their reading before it becomes too much entrenched and much harder to change later on. So the thinking was first 6 months, and then after that, at the beginning of each school year, the assessment done by the teacher who is going to be teaching that child during that year.
I guess the alternative view sometimes has been, are you then grouping children by their ability? And if you are, and you're doing that so early on, is there a danger that children at that age start to see themselves as not as good as their peers?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, Melissa, about grouping, because there always has been grouping. And children pick up which group they're in. They're in the canaries or the butterflies or the elephants or whatever. And yes, that is a potential danger, but that then depends on how the teacher manages it. So the idea of the checkpoints wasn't so much around grouping, it was just to make sure the kids who are starting to fall behind and perhaps at risk for missing some crucial steps in the beginning reading process are given support. So we weren't thinking so much about grouping, but as I've just said, New Zealand primary schools have already had grouping, whereas schools in other countries have looked at that and said, oh, wow, how does a teacher manage with 5 groups, 4 groups for reading? But that's one thing that New Zealand teachers have done extremely well, and they've been trained to do that extremely well. So in and of itself, that isn't an issue. But do some kids realise that maybe there are differences between kids who are really getting it and off to a flying start and kids who are initially struggling? Kids do figure that out fairly quickly, as we found in our own research here at Massey University. And we found on measures that relate to how kids feel about themselves, their self-perception of their reading, their self-perception of learning, that they do start to make differences and distinctions within the first 3 to 4 months of starting school.
Interesting. So they're going to do that anyway.
They are.
That school starting time is a topic for another day. I think that's a topic in itself. They're going back to the guidance or the recommendations that your group came up with. I was also interested that there were some other wider factors and recommendations, things like the appropriate furniture in classrooms. I mean, I can see how that does make an impact on learning, but was that kind of a widespread concern?
Definitely was, and I guess it's a point that the so-called modern learning environments, which what we used to call open learning systems, have very little, if any, research base behind them. Someone dreamed up that this was a good idea to revisit the open plan learning 40 years ago or so, in the 1980s, probably before, and let's give that another go. Well, as I say, it's not based on any research that I'm aware of, and I know others on the Ministerial Advisory Group weren't aware of any substantive research to support these so-called modern learning environments. The difficulty is those environments can be quite noisy, And they certainly disadvantage children who have difficulty focusing on a particular learning task. We might say ADHD children. There might be other children as well who don't thrive in a noisy learning environment. And most children will learn better by a long way where the environment, the physical environment, is more settled, it's quieter, and it's more structured. I've been into classrooms where kids are lying around in beanbag chairs trying to learn, and it's extremely haphazard. And I know the intention is well-meaning, but I don't believe it serves the learning needs of the vast majority of children who will benefit from a quieter learning environment that has a little bit more structure in terms of sitting at a desk or sitting in a chair rather than lying on the floor or in a beanbag. There might be a role for that in other types of learning situations. But when it comes to... Yep.
Some teachers, in fact, I can probably think of many teachers in many schools who would say, this is the kind of learning environment we want to create, where students are comfortable and they don't feel like it's that real kind of sit at a desk that might not suit all students, that idea of sitting and doing workbooks. So I don't know, I guess I'm asking, is there a place for that? Because I think a lot of teachers would say that there is.
There could be a place, but I don't think there's a place for that where there are systematic blocks that are fundamental to learning skills, such as learning to read, learning to spell, learning to write, and learning maths. Might be fine in music, it might be fine in art and craft, it might be fine in all sorts of other areas. But I don't believe there's any research to say that kids will in general benefit. Now, they might feel nice about it, but what are the learning outcomes for those kids, especially the ones who feel nice that they have a comfortable environment learning on a beanbag? I'm not sure. I mean, there's some research there to be done. Compare a structured, furniture-based learning environment with a free-for-all, relaxed learning environment with the same type of teaching.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear people's opinions, but as you say, there's just a lack of research in that area that we would never actually officially know, I guess.
And I think I think it's worth adding that North American schools typically have kids sitting in rows. They don't even have groups, to my knowledge, and I'm familiar with some Canadian schools more than American schools. They don't have groups, clusters, that we tend to have in New Zealand. So the row sitting, and if you think of Asian schools, for example, or we think of Singapore as a good example, I'm sure the kids in Singapore in the classrooms that I've been into, not many, but some, they're not sitting around lying around in beanbags. They're sitting in a structured environment which is very orderly, very quiet, and learning is taking place. Now, is that uncomfortable for those kids? I don't know. That's what they know. And they adapt to it.
Could you say, I guess, because, from a learning perspective, that might be the best way to learn, but there are so many other factors that go into learning, like emotional regulation and, I guess, feeling positive about your learning environment. Could that be a case for sitting in groups or sitting in other ways apart from rows? I think some of the schools that you refer to might have incredible academic achievements, but there are all of those other factors that go into a child's development.
Yeah, feeling good about a learning environment in and of itself will not necessarily create good learning outcomes. Feeling good in general will not necessarily relate to good learning outcomes. Feeling good is nice, and we want kids to feel good. We want them to feel comfortable. But if we're talking about feelings, one of the most important feelings is a sense of personal agency, a sense that, gee whiz, I can learn. I can learn the alphabet. I can learn these words. I can read that difficult book. That is very meaningful for kids who have a sense of achievement, a sense of accomplishment. Feeling good in general, we don't want kids to feel lousy, so it's not a flip side sort of a thing. But feeling good in general is a worthwhile emotional state, a social emotional state. But if we're talking about the types of feelings that are important with assisting positive learning outcomes, well, those feelings are going to be tied to the sense of success on specific learning activities and specific learning tasks. And that gets to a point that you may want to bring up, because there's a lot of what I think is false praise. Well done, Johnny. Well, often kids who are struggling know that what they did wasn't well done at all. And there's research to support this, some that I've been involved in, that others have been involved in. So what I call false praise that is just disconnected from an activity that a child has been working at does more damage and more harm than good. A summary statement at the end of the day as kids are leaving, gee, Johnny, you had a great day today, well done. That's fine, but if we're talking about feedback and praise for a specific learning task, then it has to be tied down very, very closely if you want that feedback to be effective. If you're not concerned about the effectiveness of your feedback, that's a different issue. But I think teachers should be concerned about the feedback they give to kids.
This is because you've done a lot of research in cognitive motivation and praise and expectations. What takeaways then would you say parents can take from that? Because as parents, do we need to be quite specific in praise too and say, you did a really good job reading your book, or you did a really good job sounding out your letters there, rather than that was good? You know, are you saying give the praise but be quite specific about it?
I think that's the best thing to do, and I certainly tried to practice that with my own children and now with grandchildren who are learning to read. So I've got 4 beginning readers scattered around the place. And when I'm doing reading with them, that's exactly what I'll do, be quite specific. Now, I don't expect that all parents are going to understand the need to be specific. But if there's a way to advise parents to do just what you said, wow, you read that sentence really well. Gosh, you figured out that difficult word, elephant. That's really good reading. That will help them, because that helps them develop that sense of agency, that sense that they do have the ability. It might not be perfect, but they're the stepping stones, they're the building stones.
So how do you then handle when a child hasn't got something right? What are you saying is the right thing to do?
Yeah, well, the worst thing to do is to praise a child when they got something wrong. And teachers for a few decades in our colleges of education and in other school systems overseas have been taught never to criticise a child, because that will damage their self-esteem. Now, that is in and of itself very damaging. Children need and deserve to have honest and corrective feedback, not in a way that casts any doubt on their ability. Oh, come on, Johnny, that was dumb. You can do better than that. That's very unhelpful. But I hear of teachers today who still will criticise and badmouth a child when he or she gets something wrong. Corrective feedback says, that was a good try, but you forgot to do such and such and so and so. You forgot to sound out the word. If you sound out the word, let's try that again. So it's something that's very specific. You're not casting doubt on their ability to do this. Most kids in the right environment will be able to learn to read, regardless of their overall general cognitive ability. And unless we're talking about children with very, very severe sensory disabilities. But for most children who turn up at school, there's research to show even kids with so-called very low IQs, they can learn to read. Learning to read is not correlated with a broad range of intelligence skills.
How do you balance that corrective feedback with making sure a child knows that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to fail at some things, you know, to give it in a way that makes them want to keep trying rather than think, oh, every time I do something, I keep getting told that that's not the right thing, and now I kind of just don't want to do this.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. Failure is a very good learning opportunity if a teacher manages so-called failure incorrectly. I mean, some people have criticised me for using the word failure when I give workshops. And there might be another word, incorrect. That was incorrect. It's about being specific on the particular task, not about an overall statement about the child. And it's about giving the child or reminding the child the particular strategy that should be used so that they can correct it the next time round. That's the key part. But failure is an extraordinary, I'm a living testimony to failure in my own secondary school career and early university career. Failure is incredibly important, and we can learn a lot from that, as I've learned over the years.
I think everybody has, at some point failed in something. I think I'm certainly an example of that too, and that's what you learn from, right?
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is, and I have to take some responsibility for this, in the push for a more systematic, structured approach to teaching literacy, which I'm 100% in favour of, I think we have started to forget about the cognitive motivational, the affective, the feeling states that go with it. And that a key part of that is having teachers learn how to give feedback when children succeed, and as we were talking before, how to give feedback when children struggle or when they make mistakes. That's the missing bit at the moment. It's something that I was writing about and attending to in my own teaching here at Massey University, but that's sort of fallen off the radar in favour of the technical aspects of learning how to read and therefore how to teach. But we need to also start to come back and include the fair amount of research that's being done on teacher feedback, which is one of the most important things for developing a more positive feeling about learning and about, learning outcomes in general. And that's the bit that's missing.
I guess that could go for parents too. Then parents would value and get some value out of learning that too. What is the impact of not including that?
I think the impact is that we overlook the social emotional aspect of learning. Now, that can't be tipped on its head to say, let's put kids in a warm bath and make them feel good about what they're doing, whether or not what they're doing is necessarily good. It means being very specific in terms of developing the personal agency, the personal effectiveness. We call it self-efficacy, kids feeling that what they do in a learning situation contributes towards the outcome, as opposed to another technical term, learned helplessness. Oh, no matter what I do, it's never right. I always get criticised. It's just never right. A disconnect between what a child does and always getting stuff wrong. And so it's building those connections between what a child does in a learning situation and the outcome, good, bad, indifferent, whatever. That is something that teachers haven't been taught to do, and it's something that very few parents are aware of. And neither teachers nor parents are to blame for that. We just haven't talked about it in the public media enough about what can be done at a more specific specific sort of level.
And by that you mean how to give that feedback, how to make a child feel about the way in which they're learning?
Yeah, definitely. That's so crucial to it. So the feeling state about how they're learning is important. And I think as parents, we all make mistakes. I made mistakes, and I'd get frustrated with one of my kids when it was a he, when no matter how many times I said about something, he still mucked up. And as a parent, you're emotionally involved, and as a parent who knew far too much about learning and educational psychology, I wasn't good for a short period of time until I had to hit myself on the head and say, come on, get a grip. This is not working. So it's learning how to give feedback, not be upset, but on the other hand, not just give willy-nilly, oh, that's lovely, oh, you're such a good child, you're doing so well. That's okay in general, but when it comes to reading a book with a child that he or she brings home after school, or doing some elementary some maths when he or she comes home from school, the feedback should be tied to what the child is actually doing. And positive reinforcement, praise for the good things that are quite specific, and corrective feedback, not, oh, you got that wrong again, I've told you before. Corrective feedback, remember to do this, remember to do that, remember whatever, and give it another go.
Yeah, because then I guess the thought is then the kid is going to be feeling that about their work rather than feeling that about themselves.
That's right. That's it. And you've hit it. You should come here and you should be teaching graduate students.
Oh, no, thank you. I'll leave you to that. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Chapman. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Melissa. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.